So, Charlotte, welcome to Narratives podcast, Narratives Uncensored. And this is the first episode, and I'm so happy and thrilled to have you as my first guest.
I feel very honored to be here, Vijay. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure, Charlotte. There are many reasons for me why it's fantastic to have you as a guest, not just because I've read your book and met you in person once in Heidelberg. It was a great coffee meet, and you have a unique journey, kind of a non-linear journey in my eyes, and just like mine. So your unique journey is like from being a journalist, novelist, communications specialist at EMBO and at SAP, and now as a reputation equity expert, reputation torchbearer for founders or leaders from diverse backgrounds. And your positioning is in sync with mine and also Narratrix, my agencies. So as a Caucasian cis woman, how do you find yourself in this juncture, and why do you feel you are an ally to underrepresented leaders?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think my answer has a historical element and an element from the present. And the historical element is that I grew up in South Africa during the apartheid years. I was one of the very small white population that was privileged by apartheid. But I grew up in a family that was against apartheid. We had discussions around the dining room table at night, where my parents explained injustice to me and why apartheid was wrong. And I also witnessed just terrible leaders, just the worst kind of authoritarians were, the people who led the country at the time. So I think as a child, and then I should also say as an adult, I got to vote in the first democratic election in South Africa in 1994. So having witnessed that trajectory of change from injustice and the arc bending towards justice, I think that justice and fairness and equity is a very important guiding principle for me in my life and always has been. In terms of now, so the book I wrote, We Need New Leaders, focuses on the intersection of reputation, leadership, and diversity. And the question I asked myself as I set out to write the book was, what can leaders from diverse backgrounds, diverse identities, and underrepresented minorities learn from the tools of reputation management, so the tools that I developed over my career, to land, keep, and create their dream leadership roles? The system should be doing it. But unfortunately, the system is flawed, and in some cases, the system doesn't even exist anymore. In the absence of that, it's really important that individuals learn to stand up and speak for themselves. And although I am a cis Caucasian woman, in my work in Germany, I always felt like an outsider. I never felt like I fitted in. So I have some sort of outsider experience, and I wanted to help, and I continue to want to help other outsiders succeed.
That's a great story and a great landing from your personal experience, observation, and being an empath, wanting to support, wanting to uplift, empower. And this is something like you do not put yourself on a pedestal, but you want to shine the light where it deserves. And that's really nice. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm able to connect with you and your book, because it definitely feels authentic. We need new leaders. Like I mentioned in my LinkedIn post about your book, I feel I'm one of those leaders. And I've learned a lot. And there are some aspects from the book that I would like to address in this conversation with you. So in your book, We Need New Leaders, you highlight how reputation is this often underestimated but incredibly powerful asset, especially for leaders who don't often get the spotlight. So can you share an example, a story of how reputation made or broke a founder's leadership journey, particularly in science startup space, if you're aware?
So I can give an example. There is a startup in the UK called Ivee, IVEE. It's not of science background, sorry to say. It's an HR background. And it's run by two sisters, Amelia and Lydia Miller. And the reason they started the business came from passion. And it's often the case with founders. that there's a passion or a need to fix something, some form of injustice in society, something that they feel is wrong. And for them, it was their mother. So their mother was a finance director in the UK before she had her children. Then she had both daughters, took a career break, and when she came back into the world of work, she was unable to find a job at the same finance level, but also at the same seniority level. And she ended up working as an assistant. And that was the story that they were told around the dining room table in their house. So as adults, they set out to build Ivy, which is a platform for returnees going back to work, to make sure that no matter how much time they have out of the workplace, that they're getting jobs that are commensurate with their experience, with their skills, and with the financial level that they were at when they left the workplace. And it's also a skills play. So they also are teaching folks AI skills so that their CVs have an element of AI, which makes them more appealing to employers. And they also have a reputation play. So they're teaching folks how to show up on LinkedIn so that they become more visible to potential employers. But how they've used reputation is so brilliant because their story is a passionate story that comes from within. So they don't need to learn their lines. They don't need to work on messaging. They don't need to sit and swat a briefing book. It's a story that comes from the heart. And I think it's so magical if founders can tell a heartfelt story because, first of all, it's genuine, it's extremely authentic, can attach to it, people understand why, and it explains the necessity for the business. So it becomes as much a part of the business's story as it is a part of the founder's story. And when those two things cohere, that can be very, very powerful.
That's, I think, a brilliant story. And that ties to something that I read in your book, which is the aspects of reputation. The context, within the context, you have the character, competence, and coherence. And when I think about my agency, Narratives, why I came into existence is because, there are so many experiences that I've gathered. There were opportunities that I wish I could have had. But now I want to create such opportunities for people and ensure that their voices are heard the way they want and amplify those voices. And there I find not just my context, character, but I think my competence also helps in coherence. So that is something I think it is comparable to ikigai, finding your sweet spot. So on that note, I want to ask, in your European Business Review article, you noted that as companies retract DEI commitments, I also read yesterday a comment like McKinsey's DEI reports and everything, it doesn't give any sense to certain companies, certain people to invest in DEI, and they call it stupid investment. And now founders are back to hacking the system, like me, like yourself, and the founders that you just lay out in your book, instead of changing it. So how does reputation equity become critical here under these shifting circumstances?
Your reputation is so important for founders from diverse backgrounds and diverse identities like yourself, because reputation is expensive to lose. But if you own your own reputation equity, you're less dependent on a system that's failing you. You use your stories and your passion, your ikigai. It becomes a form of business rocket fuel because it speaks to who you are as a human being, but it also speaks to where your business is going. And the best thing about it is you own it. You're in control. Whereas if we're waiting for the system to come and fix us, or we're waiting for the system to become fair, one of my values is justice. I do believe that the arc of justice will bend in the right direction, but it's going to take time. So instead of waiting for the system to fix itself and hand out, if we're thinking from a founder perspective, hand out capital to diverse founders, it's time for founders to use their reputation equity as the fuel to get there and be the owner of their own stories.
That really hits home. I normally say, own your tone of voice before someone hijacks it. Own your story before someone makes a poverty porn or diversity porn. These are the words I use. These might sound caustic, but I've seen this happening as a journalist myself. Stories getting awards which are basically diversity porn and poverty porn. And that's where you create your equity, you bring your own self to the forefront, and you take charge instead of waiting for someone. And now, in the context of science communication, in the context of science founders from diverse backgrounds, there are statistics that clearly points that they are practically invisible to investors, VCs, and also media. Although I come from media, I also come from diverse backgrounds, so I can see the unconscious bias or conscious injustice happening there. So how can science founders be authentic? How can they bring their lived experience and their science in their storytelling, not just about their company, but also their own leadership? And how can they connect these?
Well, I'll speak to it through the lens of how I work with my customers, some of whom are diverse, some are not. But I say it's about building your authority and your authentic voice, and the elements of that. It goes again to Ikigai. It's the combination of your expertise, your passion, personality, and your credibility. So if you're starting from the beginning as a founder of a science startup, you almost need to write, okay, under expertise, these are the 10 things I'm really good at. Under passion, these are the 10 things I'm really passionate about. Under credibility, these are the 10 things that make me credible. Under personality, these are the 10 things that build up my personality. If you're only getting to 7 on one of those pillars, then speak to somebody who knows you well and ask them to help you fill it in. Because sometimes we don't see ourselves the way other people see us. So get some help from somebody or more than one person who knows you well. And when you're doing that work, what you start to see is your uniqueness. And your uniqueness is the point from which you tell your stories. What has made you you? What has got you to where you are today? What has your journey been? What are you obsessed with in science that you need to fix? And that is the place from which you build your authority and your authentic voice. And those are the stories that you start to tell. And there are a number of platforms available to you. So you, for example, have started a podcast. I've also started a podcast. There's LinkedIn, there are keynote stages, there are conferences that all the time are looking for speakers. I'm learning that the more you speak, the more invitations you get to speak. So that's starting to happen for me now, which is really exciting. So find the places and the platforms and start honing your story. Each time you tell it, you're going to tell it a little bit better. It's going to get easier for you and it's going to get more comfortable. So it's that combination of go through the Ikigai process, find your stories, own your authentic voice, and then find the places to tell them.
That's a great advice. And eerily, it sort of coincides more or less with a framework that I came up with for Narratives, which I call civic, because that's the sense I want to send. So that's the deliberate framework I wanted to create. So there we talk about clarity. What exactly do you want to be known for, known about? And integrity. What makes you the authentic person to say that, and how truthful are you to your lived experience and your community, that you have a vision to solve the problem of? And visibility, how do you want to make yourself visible? And indigeneity, like what true experience that you bring that others may not have. And there you create a framework for the last C, which is credibility. And I think that neatly encompasses your framework as well for reputation. I think we each come up with our framework, but all these are in essence the same, just nuanced here and there, I believe. So it's really reassuring to hear that from you. I think about one problem when founders really want to do this, they have the itch to do this. But in science, data speaks normally louder than the stories themselves. And VCs or any investors, they look for patterns and numbers. Do you think the investor circle is changing these days? the way they see the patterns, not just from numbers, but also stories in terms of visibility, credibility. What do you think?
So I'm not a VC, though I am married to one. So what I know about investors is, through osmosis. Look, I think that data really matters. I think that experience really matters. To VCs, I think the ability to sell. Because if you can't sell, you don't have a business. And what is more important in selling than storytelling? So I think it's a combination of data and stories.
That's a great quote, by the way. Yeah. What is selling without great storytelling? Definitely. Thank you. In an interview, I think if I'm right, you said that excelling at science is only half the job. Telling that story is the other half. So, how do founders stay authentic while also being strategic storytellers? How can they? You shared a framework, you shared the aspects of reputation, and you shared the elements, which are narratives, behaviors, and networks. So, what should be the basis for founders to be strategic storytellers?
Goes to authenticity and finding your voice and owning your voice and knowing what it is. I think I'll dive a little bit into narratives, behaviors, and networks because I feel we haven't really touched on it deeply yet. So the narratives are the stories that you tell, and we've covered that quite thoroughly, in the Ikigai or the civic model. Behaviors are really important because unless you're a solopreneur, you have employees. You also have audiences that you want to reach. You have different types of stakeholders. You've got people you want to sell to. You've got partners you want to make, and you have investors. Those are all your audiences. If your narratives and your behaviors don't match, then there's a trust gap. So if you make flat statements about your business, but you do something that's completely different in your behaviors, people lose trust in you, and it's also a threat to your reputation. So people need to see that your words and your actions match. And this is the part
talk.
that you walk the talk. And this is a part of reputation that's quite slippery because you're not always in control of how you behave. So it takes an enormous amount of self-awareness to think about, how am I showing up? How do I behave? How do people experience me? And this is what came up in my research for We Need New Leaders, which is the amazing amount of self-awareness that leaders from diverse backgrounds, diverse identities, and underrepresented minorities have because of their experience of diversity in the world. So that self-awareness really is necessary to make sure that your narratives or your stories and your behaviors match. And then the third part of it is network. So where are you showing up? And not only what stories are you telling, but what stories are other people telling about you, which is out of your control, but is positively affected if your behaviors and your stories match, is negatively affected if your behaviors and your words don't match.
That's something to think about. And I think I left that half a second silence just for that to sink in for me and also the listeners. And that adds or ladders to the next aspect that you also discuss in your book, and that is pretty much covering the LinkedIn influencer or content space, trust and trustworthiness. In the age of AI, trust and trustworthiness seems to be a huge gamble, and some are losing their reputation. We just have a recent example of Deloitte using AI and not disclosing, accountability. So for me, trust and trustworthiness comes with a lot of responsibility, but also baggage. And in your book, you have a circle that, a cycle that you have drawn, which is like, how can CEOs and CCOs, the chief communication officers, they can work together. And there you put all the aspects of reputation, and trust is one of them. So what do you think diverse founders should do to establish and maintain trustworthiness?
So trust is reputation's closest sibling. And if you ensure that your narratives and your behaviors match, you won't have a trust issue. It's when that gap starts to creep in where trust becomes a problem. And I had a very interesting answer from one of the interviewees in the book who also came on my podcast, Speech Bubbles. Her name is Sarah Dorr, and for a very long time she's run a business for fractional CFOs. And she said, if I act according to my values and I act in a way that is authentic to me, I trust that my reputation will be good. She said, if I always act authentically and according to my values, I don't have to worry about my reputation because I know that I am acting in a way that I am comfortable with myself. And I thought that self-awareness was really important, but it also brings up this question of values, and it's something I always include in my interviews with my clients. What are your values? Because I think if you have that self-awareness and you know what your values are and you always act accordingly, you're very unlikely to show up ever as an untrustworthy person or have a bad reputation.
Can we say this is the direction or that creates the momentum to fill any authority gap towards building your trust and maintaining your trustworthiness? Or have I misunderstood something?
No, absolutely. It's part of the momentum. Yeah.
Okay.
So you can very consciously work on your reputation. But what Sarah said is, and she does work very consciously on aspects of her reputation. She goes on podcasts. She's written several books. She goes onto stages all the time. But she trusts herself because she knows herself very well, that she will show up in a way that's authentic and that won't destroy her reputation in any way and that won't break her various audiences' trust in her.
That's great to hear. I mean, this reminds me of your reference to Marianne Sieghart's work on the authority gap, noting female Supreme Court justices getting interrupted in their meetings. There, if people who are traditionally underrepresented, starting from women and other diverse leaders, diverse founders, when they talk about such interruptions, such aspects, then they are called out for tokenism. And when I also had a chance to visit Heidelberg once again after meeting you for a side path event convened by an investor accelerator, the person said, you cannot use the diversity card for a long time. That won't sell. And VCs, investors and media, they talk about merit. But if meritocracy has been the driving factor, there won't be this authority gap or need for initiatives like yours and mine, right? Are there any verbal or body language cues people can use to assert authority more effectively, given that they are presenting themselves in a forum, like in a public speaking event or founders pitching or founders getting interviewed?
Yeah, so I'm not a body language expert. My reputation management for me is stories, behaviors, and networks. But I do think, certainly in corporate, one of the things that I experience and which I hear women who are in senior positions in corporate who do talk about being interrupted in meetings is build your allyship. So make sure that you have people around you who say, hey, I think that she hasn't finished what she was saying. Let's just let her finish. I had another interviewee on my podcast who said she tended to be a slow thinker. And she had people around her who were very, very fast thinkers. So she built her allies and said to them, just give me a beat. Like, don't jump in. I'm going to get there. Don't be the first to speak. Let me speak in this moment, but I'm going to get there half a second behind you. So I think goes back to self-awareness. I think it goes back to understanding how you show up. I think it goes back to finding your allies and making sure that they're around you. And then owning your voice and your experience and your credibility and where you come from.
Thank you. That is something to do with how you show up. And in general, I think one doesn't need to be a body language expert, but I think what you say makes sense. I'm just wondering what it would be for a person with a neurodivergent trait like ADHD or something, they would probably be super conscious about their body language and often confused and so on. So
Yeah, and I'd just like to say that I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, I speak with an ADHD lens. I don't think there's anything wrong in owning. I don't think it's the diversity card, as you mentioned. I think it's about owning who you are and not masking and explaining that this is how you show up in the world.
right. In your book, you talk about a proactive narrative moat. Could you please unpack that for underrepresented, diverse founders in science, what that could mean in terms of authentic storytelling?
Yeah, proactive really means going out there and telling your stories, not waiting for someone to come and ask you what those stories are. So in a corporate CEO reputation context, we talk about proactive storytelling as part of building your reputation moat. And that moat is all the stories that you tell about yourself that build up over time to create trust in your audiences, so that if and when crisis hits, and it usually hits at some point, people already know and trust you. It's much easier to manage a communications crisis if people know who you are, who understand who you are, trust you, believe in you, than it is if you're suddenly in a crisis and as a CEO, your audience is like, well, we've never heard from them before. This is the first time we've ever heard from them. Why should we trust them? So from a founder perspective, it's less about crisis communications, but it's more about building that mosaic of stories to build up a reputation for whatever it is you're an expert at strategically, so that when somebody thinks, oh, I need this kind of a business, at the moment we have a need for this type of service, that you're one of the people who might come to mind. You can't do business if you're silent. People can't find you if you're not marketing yourself. And we have an incredible array of tools that are actually free for us to market ourselves as business people and tell our stories.
That's right. But when it comes to science founders, whether it's underrepresented or not, the scientific training is such that they tend to be very cognitive and focused on what they can back their statements with. But when it comes to storytelling, it's visceral, something that is opinionated. And you have worked in EMBO, interacting with so many people at different points of time. What were some of the tenets, traits that you found in them that the next generation of science founders, especially diverse founders, could?
I was not a reputation manager at that stage. All I was doing was some PR and doing a newsletter. That's your beef. So if you want to ask me that question again, and I can say, I'll point that back to you because you're more expert than me.
If I'm on your podcast, maybe that is something I could share my experience and observation about.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying. I see this is a true partnership between Narratives and Charlotte Otter, not in a way that we are finding businesses for each other, but as allies, as supporters, as people who can, hey, Charlotte is doing this. This is my limit of what I do at Narratives. So now I take, handle the baton to Charlotte. That's there. But when it comes to my podcast title here, Narratives Uncensored, what does it mean to you? And based on what we have discussed so far and what you have written in your book, what does it mean for diverse founders?
So stories are what connect us as humans. David Pullen is a great friend of mine, and he's written a book called The DNA of Engagement. And he says stories are our original technology. Stories, hundreds of thousands of years ago when we sat around the fire, stories told us we belonged. We didn't know we belonged until someone told a story. So it's the technology that draws us together as humans. It connects us. It teaches us who we are. But it also teaches us, they also teach us where we want to be. So we can tell ourselves stories about our trajectory and where we're going to go. And that's a very good way for startup founders to engage their employees on a journey. I think that the stories are incredibly powerful. And one of the things that I advise my clients is when you're building your reputation as someone from a diverse background or diverse identity, and you do that through stories, not only are you representing for the next generation, but by showing out loud how you built your reputation and by telling the stories of how you get there, you're building bridges for the next generation to walk across. So to your kinds of clients and the people that you work with, by describing out loud how you build your science startup, the mistakes you made along the way, some of the errors of judgment that you had, some of the wrong steps that you took, some of the times you had to pivot. When you describe your imperfections in a storytelling format, you build the bridge for the next generation of leaders to follow you. And then it becomes not about self-promotion. It becomes altruistic. And it shows others how they can follow you. And I find that so inspiring because then it's not all about me, and self-promotion. The talking out loud, the showing out loud, the effective storytelling, the strategic storytelling is showing the next generation how they can do it so that they don't have the same trials and tribulations and struggles as you do.
That's a great thought, actually. I used to give workshops to hundreds of researchers across the Max Planck Society here in Germany. And one of the tips I used to give is like when you go present at a conference, for example, instead of using passive voice, be more active and not by dancing your PhD, not like that, but something like instead of saying, the results were published and blah, blah, like that. Come up with a story that you remember. What stuck in your mind? Something like X and Y in my lab. They came to the lab in the dead of the night because there was something wrong and they fixed it. And thanks to that, now we have this data. Or someone who was supposed to be on Christmas vacation, but this was urgent. And us as a lab team, we came together. And because of that, we have this data. And there you acknowledge people. And there you show up not just authentic, but also an empathetic leader. You don't see just the data, but the people's efforts behind the data. And I think this is the sort of tip I hear in different words when it came from you. Thank you. And Charlotte, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and how you champion visibility for diverse founders and the power of storytelling. The very last question for the listeners: where can they find you and keep up with We Need New Leaders?
Thank you so much for asking, Vijay. So my website is charlotteotter.com. There they can find links to my podcast, links to my Substack, links to various op-ed articles that I've written, or they can connect with me on LinkedIn, where I'm extremely visible, telling my stories and living my own personal journey out loud.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was a great conversation. I can't thank you enough for being the first guest on Narratives Uncensored, which is a podcast from Narratives, my agency.
Thanks for having me.